The drive back from Alaska was supposed to feel like a homecoming. 6 months of brutal cold, 20-hour workdays, and the kind of isolation that carves a man down to his essential parts, and Jack Turner had endured all of it with the quiet, deliberate patience that had defined him his entire professional life. He had turned 42 the previous March, alone on a frozen survey site monitoring a water rights corridor, and he had celebrated with black coffee and a satellite call to his attorney back in Colorado. That was the kind of man Jack was. No fanfare, no announcements. Just work, and the steady accumulation of things that mattered. He had learned early that the people who talked the loudest about their accomplishments were almost always the ones with the least to show for themselves, and so he had spent the better part of 2 decades building something extraordinary while the world around him looked the other way. His property sat on the western edge of Pinehurst Estates, a carefully landscaped development of stone-faced homes and meticulously trimmed hedgerows that had grown over 15 years into one of the more prestigious residential communities in the county. Jack's land abutted the development on 2 sides, 43 acres of mixed terrain that most of his neighbors had written off as wild, unmanaged scrubland until they got close enough to realize it was something else entirely. The eastern portion had been cultivated into gentle meadow. The northern rise was thick with native pines and cottonwoods, and at the center of the property, tucked behind a long berm of compacted earth and native grasses, sat the reservoir, a body of water so precisely engineered and so quietly magnificent that it had taken Jack and his contractors more than 12 years and $8 million to bring to completion. It was not decorative. It was not a vanity project, though a lesser man might have been tempted to build one anyway on land that beautiful. The reservoir had been designed, permitted, and constructed as a licensed emergency water storage facility under an agreement with the State Water Resources Board. It held several million gallons at full capacity, fed by a network of underground collection channels that drew from 2 natural aquifers on the property. It supported a functioning aquatic ecosystem, including several species of native trout that Jack had personally stocked over the years, and it was maintained under an annual inspection regime that involved both state environmental engineers and the county's own water authority. Every permit was in order. Every inspection had passed. The reservoir was, in the most literal legal sense, one of the most carefully regulated private water assets in the entire state. Jack knew all of this with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had spent 30 years in the water resources industry and had built a company, Turner Hydro Solutions, that now managed freshwater infrastructure projects across 7 states. He knew the value of what he had built because he had valued similar assets for clients, litigated over similar rights in state appellate court, and testified as an expert witness in water law cases involving figures that made most people's eyes glaze over. He understood water the way other men understood real estate or equities, as a finite, increasingly precious resource, whose true worth most people would not recognize until it was gone. He was thinking about none of this as he turned his truck off the county highway and onto the long gravel access road that cut through the southern edge of his property. He was thinking honestly about a hot shower and a real meal. The last week in Fairbanks had been nothing but packaged food and logistics meetings, and he was tired in that deep, cellular way that only serious work produces. The afternoon light was long and golden, falling across the meadow grass in a way that always reminded him of why he had chosen this place out of dozens of properties he could have afforded. He rolled down the window. He let the familiar smell of pine and earth settle into the cab of the truck. He exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Then he came over the berm, and he stopped the truck, and for a long moment he simply sat there and looked at what was in front of him, because his mind could not immediately reconcile what his eyes were seeing with the image he had carried in his head for 6 months. The reservoir was gone. Not diminished. Not low. Gone. Where there had been several million gallons of still, clear water reflecting the Colorado sky, there was now a cracked and sun-baked basin of dry earth, fissured into geometric plates like the floor of a drought-struck lakebed. The compacted clay of the reservoir bottom had split and curled at the edges. Dead fish, dozens of them, including several of the native trout he had introduced years ago, lay scattered across the exposed sediment, bleached and flattened by weeks of direct sun. The inlet pipes had been physically disconnected, their ends capped with cheap brass fittings that had not been there when he left. The perimeter fencing had been cut in multiple places, and someone had driven machinery across the berm itself, leaving deep tire ruts in the carefully planted native grass cover. The pump housing's precision equipment that had cost more than most people's cars had been pried open and the control systems removed. Jack sat in his truck for 4 full minutes without moving. Then he picked up his phone and called Dale, his site manager, who had been keeping a distant eye on the property while Jack was away. Dale answered on the second ring, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who has been dreading a specific phone call for several weeks. He told Jack what had happened, or at least what he had been able to piece together from his own observations and from conversations with neighbors along the access road. The HOA had sent contractors. There had been large pumping trucks, the kind used for municipal drainage work. The operation had taken the better part of 3 weeks, conducted during the day while most residents were at work, and Jack was 4,000 miles away in Alaska. By the time Dale had realized what was happening, the reservoir was already half empty, and by the time he thought to contact anyone in authority, it was done. A neighbor named Sandra, who lived 3 houses from the HOA office, was walking her dog along the property line when Jack climbed out of his truck and stood at the top of the berm, looking down into the dead basin below. She had the uncomfortable expression of someone who had watched a wrong take place and hadn't known how to stop it, and who had been carrying that discomfort for weeks without any outlet. Her dog, an elderly golden retriever who moved with the patient dignity of an animal that had long ago made peace with the pace of the world, sat down at her feet and watched Jack with calm brown eyes. Sandra told Jack, without him even asking, that Melissa Harper had announced the drainage plan at a community meeting 6 weeks ago, presenting it as a routine landscape improvement and a matter of community standards enforcement. She had described the body of water on the Turner property as, in her exact words, an unsanctioned water feature that was creating a visual inconsistency with the community's landscaping guidelines and depressing the aesthetic coherence of the development's western boundary. The board had voted to address it. The vote had been 3-2. Sandra said she had voted against. She said that twice, as though she needed Jack to understand with absolute certainty that she had not been part of this, had not endorsed it, had not stayed silent out of indifference. She said that when she voted no, Melissa had looked at her across the meeting table in a way that communicated that the dissent had been noted and would not be forgotten. Sandra said Melissa had been very certain of herself throughout. She said Melissa had told the board that the property owner was essentially never present, that his absence was essentially permanent as far as day-to-day community life was concerned, and that the improvement could be completed before anyone who might object had the opportunity to object. She said Melissa had said those words that the man would probably not even notice, and that no one at that table, including Sandra's own no vote, had thought to ask whether that particular certainty might turn out to be the most catastrophically wrong assumption of Melissa Harper's long administrative career. Melissa Harper had been the president of the Pinehurst Estates Homeowners Association for 6 consecutive years, a tenure she had extended through a combination of genuine organizational energy and an iron willingness to make life difficult for anyone who challenged her. She was 55 years old, impeccably dressed in the way that suggested she had given her appearance enormous and sustained attention, and she ran the HOA with the focused authority that might have served her well in another context, a corporate governance role perhaps, or a regulatory body with actual legal standing. Instead, she had poured that energy into a residential association whose jurisdiction extended no further than the common areas and shared infrastructure of a private development, and she had spent 6 years slowly, methodically expanding her interpretation of that jurisdiction until it encompassed, apparently, the decision to drain a neighbor's licensed water reservoir without his knowledge or consent. She liked to describe herself at community events as a steward of the neighborhood's character. She used the word steward often. She said it the way people say it when they mean something closer to sovereign. Jack did not go to the HOA office that evening. He went home, took his shower, ate a meal, and spent 4 hours on the phone with his attorneys. Then he slept. He had learned long ago that the worst decisions came from acting in the immediate heat of a situation, and what he was feeling standing at the edge of that empty reservoir was not the kind of emotion that produced good strategy. There was a version of this evening in which he drove to the HOA office and stood in Melissa Harper's lobby until she had no choice but to address him, and he said everything that was forming in his chest as he looked down into that cracked and sun-baked basin. That version might have felt satisfying for the length of time it took to say the words. But Jack was not a man who confused the feeling of doing something with the value of what that something produced. The situation called for precision, not heat. It called for documentation and legal standing, and the kind of preparation that took nights rather than hours. He had built a company and an $8 million water asset by understanding that the most important decisions in any consequential matter are almost always the ones made before the conflict becomes visible. By the time you are standing at the edge of your destroyed reservoir, the preparation that matters most is the preparation you did years ago, the permits, the engineering records, the inspection documentation, the water board registrations, and not the conversation you have that evening with a woman who has already made up her mind about what she did and why it was right. There would be time. There was always time, when you were entirely in the right. He went to the HOA office the following morning at 9 o'clock. After a round of calls to his legal team and a brief meeting with the environmental engineer, he retained on a standing contract for the reservoir's maintenance. The HOA office occupied one wing of the development's community center, a pleasant building with a covered porch and window boxes full of seasonal flowers that Melissa had personally selected. She was in a meeting when Jack arrived, which the administrative assistant communicated in a tone that suggested this was information of significant weight. Jack said he would wait, sat down in one of the lobby chairs, folded his hands in his lap, and waited. Melissa came out of her meeting 22 minutes later. She was wearing a cream-colored blazer and carrying a portfolio binder under one arm. And when she saw Jack sitting in the lobby, she did not look surprised. She looked, if anything, slightly pleased, the expression of someone who has anticipated a confrontation and prepared for it thoroughly. She smiled at him in the particular way that communicates authority rather than warmth, and invited him into her office. He told her what he had found on his property. He asked, in a voice that was quiet and entirely even, who had authorized the removal of his reservoir. Melissa set her portfolio on the desk, folded her hands on top of it, and explained with the patient clarity of someone addressing a person of limited comprehension that the HOA had conducted a landscape review in his absence and determined that the body of water in question was inconsistent with the community's aesthetic standards. She produced a printed copy of what she described as the HOA's landscape ordinance and pointed to a clause about water features and natural area management. She spoke about property values and community character and the visual impression that Pinehurst Estates made on prospective buyers. She was calm. She was fluent. She had clearly rehearsed this considerably. Jack let her finish. Then he asked if she had contacted the county water authority before ordering the reservoir drained. She said that had not been necessary. He asked if she had contacted the State Water Resources Board. She said the HOA operated under its own governing documents and was not required to seek external approval for aesthetic decisions. He asked if she had reviewed the land records for his property before taking action. She said the HOA had its own survey records. He asked, one final time, slowly, whether anyone on the HOA board had consulted an attorney before authorizing this operation. Melissa smiled again, a little more tightly this time, and said the HOA retained legal counsel and that counsel had reviewed the board's authority under the association's governing documents. She slid the landscape ordinance across the desk toward him as though that settled the matter. Jack looked at the document for a moment, at the HOA's landscape ordinance with its clauses about aesthetic standards and visual coherence, and the community's collective right to manage its shared environmental character. He had read documents like this in a professional context many times. They were written in the language of authority, and referred to the appearance of authority, and derived whatever force they had from the widespread assumption that the people who produced them had done the necessary homework. He looked at the ordinance, and then he looked back at Melissa Harper, and asked if she understood what the body of water on his property actually was. She said she did, with the particular confidence of a woman who has not yet encountered the specific limit of what she knows. He asked her to tell him. She said it was an artificial pond creating visual clutter along the community's western boundary. The words were so precisely, confidently wrong that for a moment Jack almost admired the sheer completeness of her misunderstanding, the way it was wrong, not in degree but in category, not in emphasis but in fundamental nature, the way a person who has never seen the ocean might describe it as a large puddle and be technically correct about the water while being wrong about everything else that matters. He said, "That is a state-permitted emergency water storage reservoir. It is registered with the Water Resources Board. It has a licensed aquatic ecosystem under the County Environmental Code. Its construction cost $8 million. It holds several million gallons of water and is part of a regional contingency water supply agreement with the County Utilities Authority." The quality of silence in Melissa Harper's office changed in that instant. It was not a dramatic silence. She did not gasp or go pale or reach for her phone. She simply went very still, and something shifted in her eyes that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it, like the first tremor you feel through the floor before you know quite what it means. The landscape ordinance on the desk between them suddenly looked like what it was, a document written for an entirely different category of situation, invoked in a context its authors had never imagined, and for which it provided no actual authority whatsoever. She said, after a moment, that the HOA had not been provided with any documentation indicating that the feature had a special legal status. Jack looked at her steadily and said that was because no one had asked, and because no one was required to file their property's legal characteristics with a homeowners association. He stood, picked up his jacket, told her his attorneys would be in touch, and walked out of her office and down the community center hallway and out into the morning sun, which was warm and clear, and entirely indifferent to the particular reckoning that had just been set in motion in that cream-carpeted office behind him. The engineering assessment took 3 days. Jack's contracted environmental engineer doctor Patricia Wells, who held advanced degrees in both hydrology and aquatic ecology, walked the dry reservoir basin methodically, collecting soil samples, documenting damage to the inlet and outlet infrastructure, photographing the dead fish and the disturbed berm vegetation, and producing precise measurements of the compaction damage done by heavy equipment. Her preliminary findings, delivered in a 14-page report at the end of the third day, were stark and comprehensive. The native trout population, which had taken 9 years to establish and had included several specimens of a locally rare subspecies, was a total loss. The clay liner of the reservoir basin had been damaged by the drainage process, in a way that would require complete excavation and relining before the reservoir could be refilled. The inlet pipe network had been physically cut in 3 locations. The outlet control structure had been dismantled and its components removed from the site entirely. The vegetative berm cover, which had taken 4 years of careful management to establish, had been destroyed by machinery across approximately 300 linear feet of its circumference. She had also identified something not immediately visible to the naked eye. The drainage operation, conducted quickly and without any environmental engineering oversight, had drawn down the water level so rapidly that it had destabilized a section of the berm's internal structure. There was a measurable risk of subsidence and partial collapse if significant rainfall occurred before emergency stabilization work could be completed. The reservoir had not simply been emptied. It had been damaged in ways that would take years and enormous resources to fully remediate, and the damage extended beyond the obvious and visible into the structural integrity of the engineering itself. The cost estimate attached to the report was preliminary and deliberately conservative, and it was already alarming. Structural repairs to the berm alone would run into 6 figures. Pipe replacement and control structure reconstruction would add substantially more. The basin relining required specialized materials and contractors who operated on long lead times. Ecosystem restoration, restocking, replanting, allowing the biology to reestablish could not even be fully costed yet, because the timeline for ecological recovery remained uncertain. None of this touched the loss of water storage value or the business impact on Turner Hydro Solutions, which used the reservoir as a demonstration asset and had 3 pending client contracts that included site visits to the property. Those contracts were now in jeopardy. Melissa, for her part, maintained her position for approximately 48 hours after Jack's visit. The HOA's attorney, a local practitioner named Gerald Faust, who handled mostly routine residential matters, sent a letter restating the board's position that the action had been within its authority and that any dispute should be resolved through the association's internal grievance process. The letter was 2 pages long and cited the HOA's governing documents 11 times. It did not cite a single state statute, county ordinance, or case law precedent. Jack's legal team, 3 attorneys from a Denver firm specializing in water law and property rights, headed by a partner named Margaret Howell, who had argued before the state Supreme Court 4 times, reviewed the letter and drafted a response that was considerably shorter. It declined the internal grievance process on the grounds that the matter fell entirely outside the HOA's legal jurisdiction, identified 14 specific statutory violations implicated by the drainage operation, notified the HOA of record preservation obligations, and served formal notice that legal proceedings were being initiated. A copy went simultaneously to the HOA's insurance carrier. The discovery process that followed was methodical, thorough, and for Melissa Harper, increasingly catastrophic. Margaret Howell's team requested board meeting minutes for the prior 8 months, all contracts and invoices related to the drainage operation, internal communications between board members, the HOA attorney's billing records, and the specific legal advice that had been rendered regarding the reservoir. They also obtained from the county clerk's office the complete property survey records, the state water board's registration documents, and the county environmental permit file, a stack of documentation that, taken together, rendered the HOA's position not merely weak but legally indefensible. The board meeting minutes were particularly damaging. They showed that the reservoir drainage had been discussed at 3 separate meetings before authorization, and that in each case the discussion centered almost entirely on aesthetic concerns and property value perceptions. There was no indication in any minute that any board member had raised questions about the property's legal status, or that any research had been conducted into the reservoir's permitted uses, or that anyone had attempted to contact Jack before authorizing the work. 1 minute from 6 weeks before the drainage began contained a passage attributed to Melissa, noting that the property owner was absent and that the board should act while the opportunity was available. That sentence would later be read aloud in open court. But the document that truly defined the trajectory of the case did not come from the meeting minutes. It came from the email archive that the HOA's administrative assistant produced under the records preservation notice. Deep in a thread from 8 weeks prior, between Melissa and 2 other board members, was a message written at 11:47 on a Thursday evening. It was from Melissa's personal email account, and it read, "Go ahead and proceed with the drainage. He will not dare sue. And even if he does, HOA has more money than he does." When Margaret Howell placed that email in front of Jack in her Denver conference room on a Tuesday afternoon, he read it twice and said nothing for a moment. Then he said he would like to proceed with requesting punitive damages. Margaret said she had been hoping he would say that. The contractors who had performed the drainage work were located without difficulty. Their invoice had appeared in the HOA's financial records. The company's owner, a man named Tom Rigby, agreed to be interviewed and proved forthcoming in a way that Melissa had apparently not anticipated. He confirmed that Melissa Harper had been present at the site on multiple occasions during the 3-week operation, that she had given direct instructions to the crew chief, and that she had supervised the work personally. He produced his own records of the operation, including photographs taken for insurance documentation purposes, several of which showed Melissa standing at the edge of the reservoir watching the pumps run. In one image, she was smiling. Tom Rigby also disclosed something the attorneys had not known. During the 2nd week of the operation, one of his crew members had expressed concern about whether the drainage was legally authorized. Melissa had personally told the man that the HOA had full authority over all water features within and adjacent to the community boundary, and that if he was uncomfortable, he was welcome to leave and she would find another crew. The crew member had stayed, but he remembered the exchange clearly and was prepared to say so on the record. He said, when later interviewed by Margaret Howell's team, that something about Melissa's certainty had made him uneasy in a way he couldn't fully articulate at the time, though he understood it plainly now. He said she had spoken about the HOA's authority the way people speak about facts they have never actually verified, but have repeated to themselves so many times that the repetition has become indistinguishable from confirmation. He said she had not seemed like someone who was hiding something. She had seemed like someone who genuinely believed she was right, which, as Margaret noted in her case notes afterward, was in some respects a more disturbing quality than deliberate deception, because it meant the entire operation had been conducted not with the caution of someone who knows they are crossing a line, but with the confidence of someone who cannot imagine that a line might exist. The State Environmental Agency and the County Water Authority had opened separate inquiries by this point, initiated when Jack's attorneys filed formal complaints with both agencies in the 1st week after his return. Environmental investigators visited the site and produced their own documentation of the damage. The Water Authority reviewed the county's contingency supply agreement and confirmed that the reservoir had been an active component of the Regional Emergency Water Plan, meaning that its destruction had not merely harmed Jack Turner personally, but had reduced the county's available emergency water storage by several million gallons. That finding elevated what had begun as a property dispute into something with genuine public interest dimensions, attracting the attention of the county attorney's office, which began its own review for potential independent enforcement action. Melissa Harper, in the weeks after Margaret's team filed the initial complaint in district court, cycled through a series of positions that corresponded roughly to the stages of a strategic collapse. First came continued assertion of authority the HOA had acted properly and within its rights. Then came selective acknowledgement. Perhaps the operation had been more extensive than initially planned, but the intent had been good. Then came attribution. The contractors had made their own on-site decisions. The board had relied on counsel's advice. Communications had been misunderstood. Then, as discovery documents accumulated and the email became public in preliminary filings, came the silence that descends when a person realizes there is nothing left to say that will improve their position. The HOA board fractured in the meantime. 3 of the 5 board members resigned within 10 days of the initial filing, including the 2 who had received Melissa's late-night email and who had apparently spent the weeks since its disclosure in a state of escalating legal anxiety. They were replaced at an emergency community meeting which drew the highest attendance in the association's history, with residents standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway outside by members who promptly voted to cease defending the lawsuit and formally disavow the drainage as an unauthorized action taken without proper board consensus. They also voted to retain their own independent legal counsel separate from the HOA's existing attorney, whose advice regarding the board's authority had turned out to be, at minimum, dangerously incomplete, and, at maximum, the kind of counsel that produces careers in law review articles about what not to do. That combination of actions, the disavowal, the new counsel, the cooperation with discovery, left Melissa Harper as the sole named defendant on the punitive damages count, a position she had been maneuvering others toward throughout the affair and had now arrived at herself, entirely alone, with the email still in the record and the footage still on the drive, and no one left at the table beside her who had any reason to share the exposure. The security camera footage emerged in the 6th week of discovery. Jack's property had been equipped with cameras installed years earlier, not out of suspicion, but because the property included expensive equipment and was sometimes unattended for long stretches. The cameras covered the reservoir from 3 angles, and the footage from the drainage operation had been automatically backed up to an off-site cloud storage system that Melissa had apparently not known existed. The footage showed, in unambiguous detail, the entire operation over nearly 3 weeks. Trucks arriving, pump hoses being run to the reservoir, the water receding day by day, and Melissa Harper appearing on at least 9 separate occasions at various times of day, and once in the early evening directing crew, examining the progress, and in one moment, making a phone call while standing on the newly exposed reservoir bottom and looking out across the cracked clay with an expression that could only be described as satisfaction. In one clip from the 14th day, captured by the camera on the northern fence post, a crew member could be seen approaching Melissa and raising what appeared to be a concern. The audio was partially audible. Melissa listened, shook her head, and said something the audio captured as, "If he sues, the association will bury him. We have resources he doesn't." Then she turned back toward the reservoir and gestured toward the pumping equipment, and the crew member went back to work. That clip would be played twice at trial, at the jury's own request. The trial began on a Tuesday in early November. The district courthouse main courtroom held approximately 120 spectators, and every seat was filled by 8:30 in the morning. The case had received regional news coverage since the initial filing and had attracted the kind of attention that property rights disputes tend to generate not only from local residents, but from people across the state who had their own histories with homeowners associations and recognized in the Pinehurst situation something that felt both specific and universal. The presiding judge was Harold Cartwright, who had been on the district bench for 19 years, and who possessed the quality of judicial attention that experienced litigators recognize and respect the quality of someone who has heard every argument in every form, and whose patience with poorly constructed positions is finite and plainly too communicated. He had ruled on 3 significant pre-trial evidentiary matters before the case began, and in each instance his rulings had gone against the defense. Gerald Faust, handling Melissa's defense alongside a more senior attorney she had brought in from Denver, had the look of a man who understood that the ground beneath him was not firm. Margaret Howell opened for the plaintiff with the economy of a lawyer who does not need to oversell what the evidence already shows. She told the court what Jack Turner had found when he returned from Alaska. She told them what the reservoir was, what it cost, what it did, and what legal status it held. She told them what Melissa Harper had done, in what sequence, and with what apparent state of mind. She told them about the email. She told them about the camera footage. She did all of this in 40 minutes, without theatrics, and sat down. The defense's opening attempted to establish that the HOA had acted in good faith on the basis of its governing documents, and that any damage was an unintended consequence of a reasonable community management decision. It was a coherent argument in the abstract. It simply had very limited contact with the facts the jury was about to spend the next several days examining in careful detail. The turning point, or rather the first of several, came when the property documentation was entered into evidence. The reservoir's state water board registration, its county environmental permit, the contingency supply agreement, the original engineering plans, the annual inspection reports. Margaret walked the jury through each document methodically, and she had Jack Turner calm, precise, and unhurried on the witness stand explain what each one meant in plain language. He explained what an emergency water reserve designation meant and why it existed. He explained the aquatic ecosystem permit. He explained the contingency supply agreement and what it meant that the reservoir had been an active component of the county's emergency water planning. He explained all of this the way he explained things in professional depositions and expert testimony, clearly, without condescension, with the steady authority of someone who has spent decades knowing exactly what he is talking about and has nothing to prove by raising his voice. Then the email was entered into evidence and read aloud in its entirety, and the courtroom went quiet, in the specific way that courtrooms go quiet when a piece of evidence removes any remaining ambiguity about the nature and intent of what occurred. Then, the camera footage was played. 9 clips, totaling just over 40 minutes, showing Melissa Harper's active and deliberate involvement across 3 weeks. The clip with audible audio was played twice. Judge Cartwright watched the footage without visible expression, which, to anyone familiar with his courtroom, indicated that he was forming a very firm opinion indeed. The defense attempted through cross-examination and its own witnesses to establish that Melissa had believed in good faith that the HOA had the authority to take the action, and that any illegality was the result of an honest misunderstanding of applicable law. It was not entirely frivolous. Good faith can be a mitigating factor in certain tort contexts, but it ran directly into the problem of the email, which showed that Melissa had been informed the action might produce litigation, and had proceeded anyway on the assumption that resources would prevail over rights. It also ran into the problem of the security footage, which showed sustained, deliberate, supervisory oversight of the operation, rather than anything resembling the casual administrative decision the defense was describing. The defense also contested the damages, arguing that the plaintiff's expert valuations were inflated and speculative. This argument had the misfortune of being tested against the testimony of Dr. Patricia Wells, who turned out to be an exceptionally precise and credible witness. She walked the jury through every line of the damage assessment with the patient thoroughness of someone who knows her work is correct and is entirely comfortable having it examined. Replacement cost figures were supported by actual contractor bids filed in discovery. Ecological damage estimates were conservative by the standards of comparable cases. Economic impact on Jack's business was documented through contracts, client communications, and a clear logical chain from the reservoir's destruction to specific, quantifiable losses. When the court's own neutral damage calculation experts, appointed by Judge Cartwright, submitted their report, their figures were slightly higher than Dr. Wells's estimates in 2 of the 5 damage categories. The defense's expert found himself in the unenviable position of arguing for numbers lower than those produced by the court's own independent reviewers. Melissa did not testify in her own defense. Her attorneys had made that decision in the second week of trial, after the footage was admitted, and it was almost certainly the correct strategic call. There was no version of Melissa Harper on the witness stand that would have improved her position. But her absence meant the jury never heard her own account of her reasoning, and into that silence the email and the footage spoke with uncontested clarity about intent, about awareness, and about the particular kind of confidence that comes from believing that institutional power is the same thing as legal authority. The jury deliberated for 1 day and 6 hours. Judge Cartwright read the verdict on a Friday afternoon, in a courtroom so quiet that people in the back rows could hear the ventilation system cycling. The jury found for the plaintiff on all counts. Actual damages covering reservoir remediation, ecological restoration, business losses, and ancillary property damage totaled slightly over $4 million. Punitive damages awarded to punish willful misconduct and deter similar conduct were $8 million. The total judgment was $12 million, a figure that sat in the courtroom air for a long moment after the judge finished reading it, as though it required a breath of space before the people present could fully absorb what it meant for the woman sitting at the defense table in her cream-colored blazer, who had walked into a community meeting 6 months ago and announced a landscaping improvement with the serene certainty of someone who had never once imagined that the person on the other side of the property line might know more about water law, property rights, and the consequences of deliberate wrongdoing than she had considered possible. Melissa Harper did not move when the verdict was read. She sat at the defense table with her hands folded and her posture entirely erect, and for a long moment she looked like a figure carved from some rigid and unyielding material. Then, slowly, she lowered her head. Several people in the courtroom who had known her for years said afterward that it was the first time any of them had seen Melissa Harper look small. Judge Cartwright had one more matter to address before adjourning. He noted that the evidence presented had established not only civil liability but potentially criminal conduct, and he was referring the record to the county attorney's office for review of possible charges, including criminal mischief, environmental violations, and unauthorized interference with a registered water resource. He looked at Melissa Harper directly when he said this, with the measured attention of a man who is entirely confident in his conclusions. Then he closed the proceeding, gathered his papers, and left the bench. The aftermath unfolded the way these things do, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of consequences spreading outward from the verdict, like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. The HOA's insurance carrier began its coverage review immediately, and within 30 days issued a formal denial for the punitive damages award on the grounds that intentional acts were excluded from the policy. That left Melissa personally responsible for $8 million. Combined with her negotiated share of the actual damages, the new HOA board had accepted a settlement for the $4 million in actual damages, funded through reserves and a special assessment. Melissa's personal exposure was crushing in a way that had no easy resolution. She contested the judgment through post-trial motions and appeals that consumed the better part of 14 months. At the end of that process, every substantive finding had been affirmed. She sold her house in Pinehurst Estates toward the judgment payments, the same house she had lived in for 11 years, the house whose view she had cited at community meetings as evidence of the kind of residential environment the HOA existed to protect. She resigned from every board and civic organization she had served in the county, though in several cases the resignation followed a request for her departure. The HOA survived, reformed under new leadership that approached its mandate with a genuine understanding of what a homeowners association is and, crucially, what it is not. The new board spent its first full year of operation, revising the association's governing documents to eliminate the provisions Melissa had used to justify her authority, adding explicit prohibitions on taking any action affecting neighboring private property without documented legal review and the formal written consent of the property owner, and making board meeting records more accessible to residents than they had ever been under 6 years of Melissa Harper's presidency. They also commissioned a formal review of the HOA's reserve fund expenditures going back to Melissa's tenure, which produced findings that were referred to the county's Civil Enforcement Office. The report noted, among other items, that the Reservoir drainage project had been funded through the HOA's Community Improvement Reserve without a line-item vote, and that certain other expenditures during the prior 3 years showed similar patterns of authorization that fell short of the standards required by the association's own governing documents and state law. Those findings became the basis for 2 additional civil actions, both of which resolved in the years that followed, in ways that were not favorable to Melissa Harper. Jack Turner spent the 14 months of appeals doing what he had always done, working. The reservoir remediation ran concurrently with the legal proceedings, a 2-year project in which he was involved at every phase: the structural stabilization of the damaged berm, the complete excavation and relining of the basin, the pipe network reconstruction, the outlet control restoration, and finally, when the infrastructure was ready, the slow process of refilling from the repaired aquifer collection system. The work was meticulous and expensive and unglamorous in the way that all serious infrastructure work is unglamorous, and Jack moved through it with the same methodical attention he brought to every project his company undertook, checking specifications, reviewing inspection reports, asking precise questions of the engineering team, and occasionally climbing down into the work itself when a decision required the kind of judgment that comes from looking at something with your own eyes rather than from reading about it on paper. He worked with a new aquatic ecologist, a younger woman named Dr. Sarah Kowalski, whose research on native trout recovery in disturbed habitats had been published in 3 peer-reviewed journals to plan the restocking and revegetation program with greater ecological rigor than the original design had employed. He had learned things from the experience about the reservoir's vulnerabilities and made design improvements that the original engineering plans had not included: enhanced berm reinforcement, redundant inlet controls, a more robust perimeter monitoring system. In several technical respects, what was rebuilt was better than what had been destroyed, which was the kind of outcome that only becomes possible when a person refuses to treat catastrophe as the end of the story. By the following autumn, the reservoir held water again, not at full capacity, because that would require another full year of the aquifer recharge cycle, but enough that the surface reflected the sky properly, and the native grasses along the berm had begun to reclaim the disturbed ground in the gradual, unhurried way that native grasses do when given time and the right conditions, and the first batch of native trout fingerlings from the state hatchery, the locally rare subspecies that Dr. Kowalski had sourced through a recovery program 3 counties over, had been introduced into the slowly warming water and had, against the cautious predictions of the ecologists, begun to establish themselves with what appeared to be genuine vigor. Jack stood at the top of the berm one evening in late October and watched the surface catch the low western light, turning it copper and gold, and a flock of waterfowl that had not had a reason to land on his property in 2 years circled twice, considered the water with the evaluative attention of creatures who know exactly what they need, and settled onto the surface with the unhurried confidence of animals reclaiming a place that had always, in some essential way, been theirs. Sandra walked over from the property line to look. They stood together in the quiet for a while, watching the water. She said it was beautiful. He said he thought so too. She asked if he was glad to have it back. He thought about that for a long moment, about $12 million in damages and 2 years of legal proceedings and the lost fish and the cracked clay basin and the long drive back from Alaska that had become something so much harder than a homecoming. He said that the thing about a reservoir is that it is patient. It does not ask for recognition. It holds what it holds, and it gives back what it can, and it does its work whether anyone is paying attention or not. He said he had always admired that quality in things he built. Sandra was quiet for a moment, watching a pair of the waterfowl drift apart and then back together on the surface, and then she said that she thought patience was probably the thing Melissa Harper had never understood about anything about the property, about the neighborhood, about the kind of people who build things over 12 years, rather than taking what they want in an afternoon. Jack said he thought that was probably right. Then neither of them said anything for a while, and the evening settled around the reservoir the way evenings settle around water, slowly, completely, without any requirement that anyone be watching. The water surface was still by the time the last light left the sky. Somewhere in the reeds along the eastern shore, the waterfowl had settled for the night, invisible and quiet, and the only sound was the wind moving through the native pines on the northern rise, and the small, barely perceptible sound of water existing in the way that water does when nothing is wrong with it, holding its depth, reflecting what light remained, doing the quiet and essential work of being what it is. Jack stood there for another few minutes, his hands in his jacket pockets, looking out across what he had built and lost and built again. There is a particular kind of understanding that comes only from having something taken from you that you created with great care over a long time, an understanding not of loss, exactly, but of what endures after loss, and what returns when the conditions are right, and what it means to have built something that was worth the full cost of defending. He turned and walked back down the slope toward the lights of the house, and behind him the reservoir held its water in the dark, patient and undiminished, exactly as it had been designed to do. Some things cannot be taken from a person by anyone who lacks the wisdom to understand what they are, and some mistakes carry consequences proportionate not to what the person who made them intended, but to what they actually destroyed, which is a different kind of accounting entirely, and one that has a way of arriving, eventually, with a precision that no one who underestimated Jack Turner had seen coming, and no one who knew him had ever doubted.